Before we begin, I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that this event was organized at Simon Fraser University on Burnaby Mountain, which is located on the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish, Slaytooth, Musqueam, and Coquitlam peoples. Today's event was organized by my colleague, James Horncastle, the Edward and Emily McWhinney Professor in International Relations in the Department of Humanities. Thank you, James. The Edward and Emily McQueeney Memorial Lecture was established in 2017 to honor the memory of two longtime friends and supporters of Hellenic Studies at Simon Fraser University, and is dedicated to contemporary issues in international relations. Both Edward and Emily were committed to academic excellence and public service, and this annual lecture is part of the couple's lasting legacy here at SFU. Edward Watson McQueeney obtained his doctorate from Yale University in Constitutional and International Law and went on to postdoctoral work in The Hague, Berlin, Pisa, and Geneva. He has taught at Yale University for 4 years, and afterwards held chairs at the University of Toronto, McGill, Indiana, and most recently, and importantly for us, Simon Fraser University. Dr. McQueeney was elected to the Institut du Droit International in Geneva in 1967 and was president of the Institute for a two-year term from 1999 to 2001. He was also a member and special advisor of the Canadian delegation to the United Nations General Assembly for 3 years in the early 80s. In professional legal life, he has been Crown Prosecutor, Royal Commissioner of Inquiry, consultant to the Secretary General of the United Nations, constitutional and international law advisor to several Quebec premiers, to the Premier of Ontario, to the federal government of Canada, and to a number of foreign governments. In public life, Ted was elected twice to the Canadian Federal Parliament in Ottawa, serving successively as Parliamentary Secretary for Fisheries and Foreign Affairs. Dr. McQueeney is the author of 30 single-authored and 14 co-authored books, as well as some 500 scientific articles published or translated in 9 different languages. Dr. McQueeney was awarded the Aristotle Medal by the Greek government in 1997 for his contribution to the progress of science, free thought, and intellectual activities. Professor Emeritus Edward McQueeney QC passed away in 2015 on his 91st birthday following a short illness. He was predeceased by his wife Emily McQueeney in 2011. This lecture is dedicated to the public discussion of topics that animated the McQueeney's professional and intellectual life. We remain grateful for their contributions, which include the creation of the Edward and Emily McQueeney Endowment and the subsequent Edward and Emily McQueeney Professorship in International Relations. Thank you for listening to me. Now, I leave you to our speaker for the introduction, to James for the introduction of our speaker.
Thank you, Dimitri. I am pleased to introduce Dr. Roman Yarodimos, Associate Professor of Global Current Affairs at Bournemouth University and a faculty member at the Salzburg Academy of Media and Global Change. His research focuses on the challenges facing engagement, democracy, and global security due to globalization, digitization, and extremism. He has led research projects funded by NATO, the UK Department of International Development, the Greek Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Independent Social Research Foundation, and has published in numerous academic outlets across the political and social sciences. He has also written, directed, and produced 4 award-winning short and documentary films, including his latest film, Deterrence. Roman is the founder and convener of the Greek Politics Specialist Group, the largest international network of social science scholars on Greece. He is the winner of the Arthur McDougall Fund Prize, awarded by the Political Studies Association for his research on digital youth civic engagement. Now, for a little bit of housekeeping, I would like to remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded. If you have any questions or concerns about SFU Zoom privacy and security guidelines, I would ask you to visit the SFU IT Services website, whose link can be found in the same email provided to access this webinar. At the conclusion of the lecture, we will host a Q&A session. Feel free to post your questions in the Q&A box during the presentation, and we will try our best to address them all afterwards. During the Q&A session, if you would like to ask a question verbally, please use the raise your hand button and an AV assistant will unmute you. Finally, a reminder to please be kind and respectful. Anyone not adherent to this will be promptly removed. I am now pleased to welcome Associate Professor Roman Yarodimos. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Dimitris. Thank you very much to the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Centre for Hellenic Studies for inviting me and for organizing this lecture, and to the SFU team, Lauren, and all the team for organizing this. It's just going to share my screen, and I'm sorry I can't be there in person to deliver this lecture and meet you in person, but a small or consolation is that this format allows for friends from around the world to join us, and that's great. When James invited me to deliver this lecture, especially when we realized that it's probably going to have to be online, I was reflecting on the sort of affordances of different formats, and how a format of a webinar is very different from the intimate setting of a small seminar room, and it requires a leap of faith, a leap of the imagination on both parts. So I'm going to use Tom Gould's cover of the New Yorker this week. This is kind of like how I imagine you, the audience, a captive audience, to be at home, and hopefully you'll find some material today that will be of interest to you. And I very much look forward to our discussion. So the topic that I want to talk about today is basically something that I think is really important. The premise of my talk is that I think we're at a crossroads, and in the West, but also in the world, and we need to ask a question that is basic, but sometimes basic questions are the toughest ones. And that is whether there is a future for the West, whether that concept actually even makes sense anymore. So I think we've all witnessed phenomena within the West of civic malaise. We've seen the rise of populism. We've seen anti-systemic movements and parties take over or have electoral success in the United States and Europe. We had Brexit, we had the Trump presidency, which was obviously a big disruption in the West, but also in international affairs generally. And I guess one of my arguments today is that these two forces, what happens within the West and what happens in the international system, they're very much linked. So I think we need to reflect on that and ask that question. I don't think we've asked that question of what exactly does the West stand for. So today I will be referring to I will be drawing from data from some studies that I recently concluded on Russia, on the documentary that James mentioned just now, Deterrence, and also from a book that was published in Greece earlier last year, and from a couple of recent journal articles and studies that are available online. So very, very briefly to outline my talk, I will introduce, I think, sort of the thesis that we are experiencing a sense of civic malaise in Western liberal democracies. I will look at the global context, and that global context is not unrelated to what happened in the West. I think the two are, as I said, very much related. Then move to specific security challenges that we're facing and strategies that are there to address those challenges. A really key issue is values, and that's something that's been coming up a lot, again and again in our research, in the discussions, elite discussions, but also public discussions about security and about the state of the world today and about the state of political institutions. So values seem to be driving young people's engagement today a lot more than they were 15 to 20 years ago. They are at the forefront of the thinking of political organizations, and they are essentially what distinguishes liberal democracies from more authoritarian regimes. So in order to understand that sort of sense of civic malaise, we need to sort of look at the macro picture. We need to look at macro trends and to understand the context. I'm not going to go into these macro trends in a lot of detail. I just think it's very, very important to understand those phenomena that have been unfolding in the West over decades. And if you like, the central theme is the role of the individual in late modernity, and how we have, how liberal democracy has materialized, how it has realized its central vision to empower the individual. And part of that is a decline in grand narratives and hierarchies, and maybe a decline of trust in institutions and collective forms of organization. Sociologists and political scientists such as Robert Putnam have documented the structural decline in social capital or in traditional forms of social capital in Western societies. There's a lot of research showing declining importance of political parties, trade unions, other such traditional forms of organization. The rhetoric of respect and duty and responsibility has given way to a rhetoric that focuses on the rights and self-fulfillment of the individual. And of course, as part of this culture, we have embraced openness, we have embraced criticism, which sometimes turns to cynicism. So these are all the traits of liberal individualism, and if you like, they're both the superpower of the West and its kryptonite, in the sense that it is exactly what liberal democracy is meant to do, but also it is what always in a democracy gives space to forces that are there to question it and challenge it. So a really interesting question that has come up over the last few months, especially with relation to the pandemic, is whether liberal democracies of the West are better or sort of less well placed to address the issue of the pandemic. There was a theory that more authoritarian, more sort of centrally controlled governance regimes, such as those in Asia, or for example in China, have had a better track record of managing the pandemic precisely because they're not as liberal. To be honest, I don't think that argument is very strong. First of all, because there are other factors, such as the experience of Asian countries with other epidemics, but also because we've seen examples of success and failure within the same liberal democracies. So in the UK, it was the same government that failed to take early measures because perhaps of its liberal instincts, but it's the same government that now is in Britain that is running a highly successful vaccination campaign. The same goes for Greece, which I know is of special interest to you today, and handled very well the first lockdown and also the vaccination campaign, but has faced other issues. And so I think the picture is very complex, and I think we should avoid to jump into conclusions about the efficacy of liberal governance. I don't know that it is necessarily a weakness, a structural weakness that means that it's unable to handle crises. I don't necessarily think that the evidence supports that view. However, there are structural issues both in the West and across the world that have put a lot of pressure on individuals within Western societies. Of course, globalization and risk and change, including technological change and tethering to devices, and complex, fragmented global governance, and also structural inequality that has particularly hit the middle classes and has hindered upward mobility and a sense of fairness. So there's a lot of, again, these are very complex and multi-layered phenomena. I'm not going to go into detail, but I guess the important point here is to say that all that what that has created is an identity crisis within large parts of Western societies, and it's not a coincidence that the central slogan of Brexit was "Take Back Control," because it was based exactly on that idea that the Western citizen today does not have control, either because they are not able to handle sort of multiculturalism. Some people have argued that, or that they are not. They feel that technology and speed of life and the complexity of life in the 21st century and the fluidity, as Zygmunt Bauman would say, creates a sense of risk and a sense of threat. So these questions, again, these phenomena take us back to that central question of who are we? What do we stand for as the West? Where do we belong? And for that, I think we need to go back into sort of the foundational elements of political theory and think about what makes a community. So a community, for a community to exist, you need two very important things. Within the community, you need shared experiences, you need shared joys, you need rituals, you need what psychoanalysts Lacan called jouissance, which is that shared joy of being able to essentially have fun with the same things, to have consistent cultural codes and references, to have a sense of purpose and meaning in life. So these are all the positive things. Of course, they're not always positive in the sort of benign sense. They can have they can take a darker turn if that shared joy is at the expense of others. But they don't have to. They can be positive and benign. And then you also, for a community, you also need an outgroup. You need somebody to be outside of the community. Potentially, usually communities are formed to protect themselves from an external threat, from an enemy that is threatening them, from an other that is in some fundamental way different from them. So as you'll see, these two elements of the community map or sync with those phenomena that are currently taking place, which are challenging the identity of the West, its self-image, both within it and in the world. And at the core of any identity and of any community is of course values, is the values that we share. The values are the binding glue that brings together a group of people. Of course, a community has other things. It has laws, it has enforcement mechanisms, it has institutions. But in terms of the identity and the sense of belonging, values and those shared joys and the shared threats are quite key. Now, the problem with the construct of the West, the concept of the West, is that it is questionable whether it's sort of run its course, whether it's passed its use by date, because the West is, to an extent, or for our contemporary uses, a product of the Cold War. The West used to be juxtaposed to the East being either Russia or China. The West also has a dark history of colonialism, nationalism, leading to the Holocaust, Cold War and post-Cold War interventionism in all parts of the world that have really made any sort of claim of moral superiority almost untenable. It's very hard for a Western government today to claim that it somehow is automatically, just by virtue of being Western, morally superior to a government or another country. So these qualities have to be earned. Western societies have embraced multiculturalism to a large extent, which has further meant that they have had to negotiate their shared values and their shared codes. And a lot of what we're seeing today, and a lot of that is happening in social media, unfortunately, is that renegotiation of cultural codes when change happens. And also, it is in the nature of liberal democracies to encourage dialogue and dissent and openness, and that, of course, is oxygen for democracy. But also what it means is that as part of this process of reflecting and criticizing, sometimes you throw the baby out with the bathwater, to use sort of a cliche. And we have done that quite a lot in the West. So all these points make it really hard to think of what the West actually means today, what its meaning, what its essence is today, versus other parts of the world. So the three questions I want to pose before I pause for a moment and move to what's happening in the world is, are there values that we still share as a community in the West? And what are these and how do we articulate them? But also, what are the shared challenges to our security that we're facing? I think these are fundamental questions to engage with when you try to decide if the West has meaning as a construct. Now, I just want to briefly talk about what's happened in the world over the last 30 years, which very much has to do with what's happened in the West. So after the end of the Cold War, we of course, we saw the emergence of the United States as the sole superpower, and the US and its allies engaged in military interventions in the Balkans, in the Middle East. And we reached the peak of US power in early 2000. I would say that 9/11 is at the same time the peak of US power and the point where its power begins to decline because of the disastrous handling of the aftermath of that attack, and especially the wars in Afghanistan and particularly the war in Iraq. So a super quick sort of review here of what happened, because I think it's important to understand how we got where we are. The war in Iraq, partly, and in these hours that you see there are, of course, don't necessarily imply a monocausal relationship, but they're also chronological, but there is a correlation there. So the war in Iraq directly or indirectly led to the creation of ISIS. At the same time, with WikiLeaks, you have the Arab Spring, and these two events, ISIS and the Arab Spring, lead to the Syrian Civil War. The Syrian Civil War, one of the side effects is the huge migration refugee crisis that the Middle East and Europe faced in 2015-2016. At the same time, ISIS engages in international terrorism across the world, but also, crucially for the argument today, in Europe. And in the background, you have the 2009 global financial crisis and the emergence of social media, especially Facebook and Twitter, as key conduits of public dialogue over the last 10 years. And what these things all together do is they create an environment of populism that allows the sort of Brexit referendum to happen and to succeed, the Trump campaign, but also the emergence of far-right and far-left political parties in countries such as Germany. So this is what we call the new world disorder, in the sense that the post-war and the post-Cold War framework of the norms-based international order is now being questioned. And my sort of central argument is that this is happening not for any other reason, but because it was the West itself that made strategic mistakes. It was the West that retreated or mishandled situations. It is the West that has been in strategic confusion since the end of the Cold War, and that has created stalemate in institutions such as the UN, NATO, and the EU. So within the West, we're seeing a crisis of identity and values, and then beyond and within the EU, you've seen the emergence or re-emergence of liberal and authoritarian governments. So, for example, in the European Union, the governments of Poland and Hungary have been criticized repeatedly for their track record on how they handle the press, how they handle minorities, how they handle constitutional affairs. So it's happening within the European Union as well. So it looks like we're returning to a version of realpolitik. Maybe we never left realpolitik. I don't necessarily think that humanity can leave realpolitik aside, but realpolitik cannot be the only force that drives international relations. Cooperation is equally important in coexistence and norms and values. Otherwise, you end up with chaos, of course. So what challenges does this new world disorder create, and what evidence is there that it's happening? And I think you need to look no further than what has been happening, what the government of Russia has been engaging in over the last 20 years. And again, this is something that we have investigated and we have observed over a period of a long time, which is basically a strategic and systematic campaign to influence, to infiltrate, to erode Western liberal democracies. And I know these words sound very heavy, but when we started this research, when the evidence started to emerged a few years ago, it looked unlikely, but then when you join the dots, you realize that this is what's been happening. So ongoing hacking and cyber attacks against a multitude of Western targets, fake news campaigns through Russian media, domestically and overseas, character assassinations against journalists or activists who question the regime, either in Russia or even beyond Russia, intervening in elections or in referenda like the Scottish referendum, Brexit referendum, the 2016 US election, through bots and trolls and leaks and various other means, funding or supporting political parties of the far right and the far left throughout Europe, and military escalation, including non-compliance with the INF Treaty. Of course, the United States withdrew from the INF Treaty, but before that, there was sort of consistent breaking of that treaty on the part of Russia, and perhaps quite chillingly, assassinations and the use of chemical weapons on UK soil, with the case of Litvinenko in 2006 and the case of the Skripals in 2018, which had public health implications as well. And we've seen sort of Russia engage in wars or hybrid wars with its sort of former satellite states in Georgia and Ukraine. So it's not a coincidence that these things are happening. There's often this discussion about when did the new Cold War begin, but I think you need to go back in time to see that, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But first, it's important to understand the implications that these activities have, and they affect not just the physical safety of people involved, but really the institutional health of democracies. It's about trust in the system, but it's also about really belief in the concept of truth. So just to give you two very quick examples, the case of Lisa back in 2016, when there was a disappearance of a 13-year-old Russian-German girl, and it was reported by Russian media that she had been sexually assaulted by Arab migrants, and there was a whole backlash by far-right groups on Facebook against migrants. There were actually physical attacks. And then the Russian foreign minister came out and made a statement about the inability of the German system to take these cases seriously because of political correctness. But actually, the whole story was fake. Lisa was with a friend. But the point here wasn't really the details of the case. The point was to sort of stir that hatred or to create a social unrest in the context of the 2015-2016 migration crisis, with Germany having received 1.5 million immigrants and refugees from the Middle East. The other example is, of course, the case of the Skripals, where even though sort of there was evidence early on that this was a Novichok attack, which is not something you can get off the market outside, it was clearly evident and became proven later on that it was the Russian services that did it. Russian media produced not one or two, but 46 different theories. And the point of that was not to promote one version of the truth. The point is to make the truth irrelevant. It is to erode the public debate with conspiracy theories and fake news to the point where audiences don't care about the truth anymore. And the same thing has happened when you had race riots because of racist attacks in the United States, or any other social issue that polarizes Western society. You see the troll factories being activated, and it's not about one side or the other. It's about supporting both sides, just so that the unrest and the sort of the social unrest gets worse. So Hannah Arendt famously said that freedom of opinion is a farce unless factual information is guaranteed and the facts themselves are not in dispute. So the attack on truth and fact directly affects our sense of freedom and our freedom of opinion. And again, going back to when this whole thing started, I think you have to go back before even Ukraine, before Georgia, even before Litvinenko, probably to the 2004 election in Ukraine, when there was an attempt to stop democratically elected President Yushchenko from to sort of stop the election from happening and him being elected, and that was at the point when there was a kind of like a proxy war in Ukraine about Ukraine's future. So I think it's important to put these phenomena in historic context. The important question here is also about what the next step might be, and I think this is why it's so important to understand the trajectory of these phenomena, because my assessment is that Putin has been engaging these acts just because there was no response from the West, and it's actually not just my assessment; it's that of many other people who have looked into this. And so the question is, if you don't deter further attacks, then what would be the next natural step? Now, the other major source of potential or emerging security concerns for the West is China, which has expanded its influence globally. It has expanded its influence in Latin America, definitely in Africa, in the Middle East, in Europe. Very much it's embedded in terms of trade and industry and infrastructure, but it's also been engaging even in recent days in major cyber attacks and hacking attacks against Western targets. There have been multiple reports in the UK media about how Chinese agents are infiltrating Western universities, and there was a discussion about Huawei and 5G in the United States and Europe. So there are many security concerns about China's role in the world and how it's trying to sort of revise the status quo globally. It's interesting that that we saw the phenomenon being expressed in Hong Kong when China expanded its sort of rule, and we shouldn't be surprised if the same thing happens in Taiwan at some point. And it will be interesting to see how Western leaders react to that. And of course, we've seen an interesting response by the Chinese government in terms of the COVID story and the World Health Organization investigations. And there has been a systematic attempt through op-eds in various European newspapers to change the narrative that not just that China didn't declare the truth early enough, but maybe that the virus didn't even originate in China. So the final sort of case study, if you like, of countries that pose security threats is Turkey. And Turkey is a surprising one because it's a NATO ally, it's a Western ally, it's a NATO member state, of course, and it's a very important country geopolitically. But in recent years, it's has changed its profile and now is in danger of becoming a rogue state by intervening in various conflicts in the Syrian, invading Syria and sort of persecuting the Kurds, becoming involved in the Azerbaijan-Armenian conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, in becoming involved in Libya, sort of launching a series of hybrid attacks against Greece in Evros in the Aegean Sea, and then sort of in a campaign of expansion in Eastern Mediterranean Sea, engaging in kind of like a rhetorical war with France and threatening to block NATO action in the Baltics. So Turkey has been punching above its weight geostrategically, and the only reason that has been happening, the only reason any of the things that I mentioned now have been happening, is because the West has failed to understand, identify, and respond to these phenomena over the last 15 years. It's failure of deterrence, a failure of a strategic vacuum created by this situation both in the US, in Europe, and the West, and this sort of existential crisis that has created this power vacuum. And by that, I'm not arguing for, by the way, for a kind of like a sort of military response, or I'm not arguing that the relations between the West and Russia or China and Turkey have to deteriorate. By no means. I think Russia is an integral member of the European civilization. China is intrinsically codependent, interdependent with the West in terms of trade, and the West and China should work together on climate, on nuclear non-proliferation, on a host of global challenges. And of course, Turkey is a NATO member state and a Western ally. But the reality is that the phenomena I just described have been happening and will continue to happen unless somebody draws a line and says enough. And it will be interesting to see what the Biden administration does on that. And I'll come back to that towards the end of my talk. But the point here is that what is needed is a clear red line about what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable. So is it acceptable to launch a chemical weapons attack in Salisbury against sort of foreign targets? So what's stopping the West from protecting itself? A very important factor is plausible deniability of hybrid warfare, which is by definition deniable. But also, so the fact that conventional deterrence is not an option. You're not going to nuke an adversary just because they've launched a cyber attack against you. The West is also dependent on those countries for a number of resources, such as energy and trade, and also, in the case of Turkey, borders. So another issue is that Western countries have very different perceptions of their security threats. So a country in Southeast Europe will have a very different security perception from a country in the Baltics. France is facing a very important, very persistent problem of Islamist terrorism, whereas Lithuania is sort of faces the threat of a physical attack from Russia. So it's hard to reach a consensus, and the organizations that are based on consensus at the top level, including the EU and NATO, one of the reasons for the political stalemate is precisely that need for consensus, which means that it's very hard to take action and prompt action in the case of a hybrid attack. So this is sort of the outline of the main security challenges facing the West, and they range from physical security to energy security, terrorism, nuclear proliferation, and to sort of other issues that we don't often necessarily associate with security, but they're very much security issues, like climate security, environment, and international organized crime, which we know is, again, very much linked to both corrupt regimes and weapons of mass destruction, but also creating huge problems within Western countries. And then I would also add social media and polarization of fake news as a security threat, because that phenomenon has been eroding the health of liberal democracies from the inside. So without sort of demonizing social media, and this talk is being broadcast on Facebook, and we all use social media for good reasons, and they're amazing, but equally the architecture of the media and the lack of regulations mean that they've ended up being sort of toxic spaces for public debate. However, I would say that perhaps the most significant security challenge doesn't come from the outside, comes from what I described earlier, which is that erosion of identity and of values, which means that a community sort of stops functioning as a community at a certain point, after which it cannot defend itself. So briefly, I want to mention deterrence, which James mentioned before, and we'll have on Thursday we'll have another session with a screening and Q&A. So I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but basically Deterrence is a pedagogic and research and practice project and a web doc that we recently produced at Bournemouth University, and I carried out some research with young people and with elite interviews. We immersed ourselves for a year in debates around security, around the future of NATO. We attended the NATO Engages conference and then the 2019 NATO leaders meeting in London, and we interviewed various people there, and then another conference in 2020. So over the last couple of years, I've been immersed in these debates, and the central thing I've been trying to establish is, first of all, what are the what is the agenda, the security agenda of the elite, of the decision makers, but also what are the perceptions and the narratives and the priorities of young people, and to compare these. So if you watch Deterrence, you'll see it sort of split into 8 chapters, and starting with sort of introduction, then ending with NATO in the 21st century, and we'll screen chapters 6 and 7 on Thursday. But it covers sort of a range of timelines and concepts and issues. There are also learning resources on the website, and including lesson plans and reading if you're interested. But I want to focus just on that point of the youth versus the elite narratives. And the first thing that came out of the youth research was almost complete lack of awareness of what NATO is. I mean, literally, the question was, what is NATO? And the troubling fact is that this wasn't just the young people saying this, it was their parents and their parents' friends. So that, I think, has to be of concern, because citizens in the UK are not, at least the ones we spoke to, don't seem to be aware of that security architecture. There is, of course, this issue that a security architecture can be a victim of its own success. If it's too successful, if there are no visible threats, then people tend to forget about the environment that creates that security. I should also say that a lot of young people, or some young people, mentioned Kosovo, and I think that campaign in Kosovo has been particularly, has left a legacy in terms of the public mind and perception of NATO that has been a challenge for NATO to overcome. Now, interestingly, when we spoke to young people about security, the 2 issues that they mentioned were terrorism and nuclear proliferation. Terrorism is not something that NATO has traditionally engaged with, and it's something that is still dealt with by domestic security services. And then perhaps the most important thing, definitely the most important thing that came out of the youth research was an emphasis on values. It became clear through the interviews and through the discussions and the workshops and the student work that I saw, that it was the emphasis of young people on sustainability, environmental sustainability, and social justice were drivers for their perceptions of any security debate, and actually, in fact, any political institution. So young people today don't necessarily make the distinctions between domestic affairs and foreign affairs, or domestic institutions and intergovernmental institutions that we used to make, maybe in the Cold War or just after the Cold War. So anything from like the national government and above is part of the same space in terms of how they perceive it. And it is their values that driving those perceptions. And one thing I have to note here, and I'm referring to some research I did several years ago on drivers of youth engagement, is I think there's been a remarkable shift in the drivers of engagement from what we used to call me drivers, so things that relate to me and myself and my community, to we drivers, so to factors that have to do with the community, have to do with the world at large. So it's not to say that previous drivers of engagement, like positivity and empathy and visuals and so on, these are all still there, but on top of them you've seen the emphasis on justice, equality, and sustainability. And I think the turning point in that shift, in that value shift, was around the financial crisis of 2009 and the austerity that followed in Europe, at least. That seems to have played its part, and perhaps the gig economy and the realities facing young people in the West today, maybe that has something to do with that as well. Now, in terms of the elite narratives, they were quite different. So as you'll see if you watch the documentary, a lot of that has to do with Russia, China, the relations between the US and Europe, Trump's role, which I've now sort of removed here because that's not a factor anymore, hybrid and cyber attacks, the debate around budget contributions to NATO, but also Erdogan's Turkey and how that is affecting the political negotiations within NATO. But perhaps above all else, that sense that the West's and NATO's internal unity is a threat, and that it needs to be nurtured. And again, the same word values, if you look at all the documents that are coming out of NATO, NATO 2030, and various other policy papers that are coming out, values, the issue of values is the central one, because that's what's driving public attitudes towards political institutions. So an organization is not viable if it's not legitimate, and it's not legitimate if it doesn't appear to be serving the values of its constituency. So if we go back to the list of security challenges that I mentioned before, these green challenges here, the physical security, hybrid security, and social media, I think they are very much at the heart of NATO and the EU's agenda and radar. They're definitely part of the elite narratives. Energy security and terrorism, much lesser extent, they're much more within domestic, or sort of if there are sort of bilateral or multilateral agencies that work on terrorism, but they're not necessarily part of mainstream security discussions, be at sort of the top level of international organizations. Environment and climate security is something that elite decision makers don't really speak of at all, and that's something that was put forward by our young participants, and there was almost some resistance on the part of elite participants to accept climate security issues or environmental issues as security issues. And then two issues that I think are completely under the radar. One is to do with international organized crime, which I mentioned before, and I personally think that is, if nuclear proliferation is the single most important existential threat for humanity, then international organized crime is, in terms of day-to-day life, it is the single most important disruptor of any sort of functioning liberal democracy or society, because it has to do with tax evasion and tax avoidance, it has to do with drugs, it has to do with social cohesion, it has to do with trafficking of weapons and bodies and so on. So I believe we have to look at international organized crime much more closely as a security threat. And also just to say that sort of internal disunity or crisis of identity, I think, is slowly being picked up, not necessarily as fast as we would like it to be, but it is being picked up finally. And in terms of what can be done, like, or the strategies that the West can employ to address those security threats, these could range from deterrence to resilience. We hear a lot about resilience, especially in the context of hybrid warfare, in terms of or hacking and cyber attacks, of making our systems more resilient, of strengthening our democratic institutions. Countermeasures are possible, and in fact, we just saw in the news a couple of days ago that Western governments are considering countermeasures for certain hacking or cyber attacks. Other tools at our disposal are economic sanctions and visa freezes that would make, or diplomatic isolation that would make life harder. And while these can be seen as countermeasures or as part of resilience, essentially they can be fundamentally part of deterrence, because if you raise the cost of a hostile action enough, then that will deter the next actor from engaging in these acts. And then I would propose that there are also activities such as big tech regulation and digital media literacy can also be part of a toolbox, of a security toolbox. And in fact, digital media literacy is part of the EU's and increasingly of NATO's toolbox. So there is, it's not like there's nothing we can do about these security challenges. There is a range of tools at our disposal, but perhaps the most important one is that credibility and consistency about being prepared and determined to use those tools if needed. So as I mentioned before, the central thing that kept coming up again and again in this research and in these discussions in various organizations, and I think is crucial, is the question of values. And values matter because they are essential to who we are as people, as individuals, and they're essential to who we are as communities. And literally what value means is what you assign value. You assign value to something. It means that you are prepared to sacrifice something for that, right? So we need to ask ourselves, what are the things that we will be prepared to make sacrifices to safeguard? And in fact, that's why the film starts with the quote of, in this life, what is it that you treasure the most, and what are you prepared to do to protect it? Because is that link between security and values. And values like democracy and security and free and fair elections, the rule of law, the equality for women and LGBT people, freedom of expression, social justice, protection of minorities, and pursuit of happiness, they're not abstract. They're not negotiable. If you are an immigrant, if you're a young kid growing up in any country, and you are in any way not sort of the dominant majority, whether that's because of your religion, your sexuality, the color of your skin, or your disability, these values are not abstract. They are very much part of your survival. So I think we need to not take lightly what we have built as sort of a culture in the West, and not to give it up so easily. And the next thing to say is that phenomena such as deepfake or hybrid warfare or increasingly artificial intelligence, what they will do inevitably, and this is does not carry value, I think it's a fact, they will challenge our understanding, our engagement with the concepts of truth and freedom. So the concept of truth, I think, will be perhaps the most contested truth of the 21st century, and with that comes freedom, because without truth, without science and journalism and law and all the things that depend on truth, you can't have freedom. And at the same time, as I was saying earlier at the beginning of my talk about the role of the individual in late modernity, we will inevitably see a quest for a moral and spiritual framework in the West as a result of the crisis that is facing liberal individualism. And so we will see people will definitely look for places and spaces and communities to join and feel a sense of belonging, and we've seen that during the pandemic as well. And that will only become more marked during the rest of this century, because we almost reached a peak in individualism, and now we will see a retreat. And so it's really vital and crucial for our values that retreat does not come through authoritarianism or populism, that it comes through by sort of abiding by these values that we just mentioned, and essentially the legitimacy of institutions both at domestic and international level are at stake. So to conclude, does the construct of the West still matter? I think it does, because our values are meaningful, they are existentially important, and they are under threat. And at the same time, the national is too small to deal with the agenda of the 21st century or the global challenges that we're facing, like the pandemic. But at the same time, the fully globalized, the cosmopolitan, is still aspirational. Globalization is imperfect, it's flawed at the moment, and it needs a lot of reform. So we can't depend on the national, and we can't depend on the global. So I think that broader community of the West is still relevant in that respect. Now, of course, we need to do a better job of articulating our shared characteristics, the shared threats that I just mentioned. We need a much clearer consensus on values, and we also need to assign meaning to them. It's not enough to say as an organization that you believe in freedom and democracy and then allow a country or a regime that is liberal, that is persecuting minorities, that is engaging in acts of war or other sort of transgressions to not face any sanctions or any cost for their actions, because that nullifies your thesis that you believe in these values. So there needs to be some consistency between the words and actions, I think. But equally, though, the West needs to be very modest, and the United States needs to be very modest about its role, its image in the world right now. After 4 or 5 years that have been very detrimental to its soft power, to its image, it's not like we can go back to the late 1990s. I don't think the world can afford, it certainly couldn't afford a second Trump term, but I don't think it can afford even a third Obama term. It's sort of the paradigm of engagement with the world has to be different. And we've seen, while these broad values, I think, are shared by the Transatlantic Alliance, there are still difficulties and differences of opinion, both between the United States and Europe on issues like China or Russia or budget contributions, because countries like Germany, for example, depend on Russia for energy, and other countries have very close ties to China, and the United States is much more likely to have a stronger stance towards Russia and China than some EU countries do. But even within Europe, there are very robust debates about various aspects of European Union, including values, actually. So it's the road towards that sort of resurgence of Western values is not going to be easy. Now, in terms of what is likely to happen, we've seen in recent weeks and months a shift towards multilateralism, towards various organizations engaging with not just with Western countries, but with countries like India and South Korea and Australia and New Zealand. So what you might see is actually a global West, not in the sense of sort of a neo-colonial expansion, but in more like in the sense of a global coalition to defend liberal democracy and also to promote, to defend the stability of the international system, the norms-based order. And I think in order to do that, that will be sort of empty, that will be sort of vacuous as a point, unless you're determined to support it with red lines, unless you say, this is a red line I draw, but these red lines need to be clear, they need to be credible, and they need to be reasonable. So I think that's the main argument that I had today, but I'm be very happy to answer your questions and to discuss this further, both today and on Thursday as well.
Well, thank you for such an informative and interesting talk, and it seems like we're already getting quite a few questions already coming in about the talk here. Just a reminder that if you have any questions, you can post them in the Q&A section, or if you would like to ask them personally, you can end up using the raise your hand function, and we will unmute you so you can answer it. Now, we'll start off here with the first question that was posed. Much of the issues you raised that are facing Western liberal democracies seem to be based on the shortcomings of laissez-faire capitalism. What reforms to the economic system in place in the West do you believe could negate and hopefully fix these issues?
Yeah, this is a great question. So, so I think, first of all, it's as a premise to an answer, I think it's important to acknowledge that you know, there are different shades of capitalism, and there's different shades of capitalism in time and in space. So within this moment, there will be different versions of capitalism in Scandinavia, in the United States, in different parts, in Canada, in different parts of Europe, right? And then if you go back in time, again, so it's I wouldn't say that necessarily an economic system is sort of it's like binary, or it is sort of a one thing that is very coherent. But you're absolutely right, and I think in terms of the structural inequalities that I mentioned that have been driving a lot of the malaise in the West, you can trace their roots back into maybe the 1970s and 1980s, when specific reforms were implemented that then led to, for example, the creation of financial products that are of questionable value to the world generally, and that maybe led to the 2009 crisis. So I think it's hard. It's hard to implement. I mean, for me, the most important reform that we would need to see wouldn't even be just within the West. It would be a global agreement to abolish or ban tax havens, because that's where a lot of the siphoning of funds and a lot of the money from tax evasion and organized crime goes. And I know it sounds really abstract, but it's not abstract. It's like your taxes and my taxes, and the money that we need for people to go into hospital when they have COVID and to be treated. It's the same money that we don't have because it's been sort of sent off to a tax haven by somebody who's engaging in these activities. So the link for me between tax havens and a global agreement on tax havens, I mean, that would be the first thing to do, because what you do then is you allow that body of that capital to not sort of to flee from outside the system, and so it can be part of the economy. But I don't think that's necessarily, I don't think that's going to happen right now, but I don't think it's unrealistic. And another thing might be sort of certain taxes on global financial transactions, any of those things that could, again, have an important effect. But within the West, I mean, I think, you know, the agenda of the Biden administration, which is an emphasis on infrastructure that would give more jobs to people, I think is really, really important. Anything to do with reskilling people, because again, with AI, millions of people might find themselves out of jobs or without having the skills to survive in the new economy in 5-10 years, and maybe public frustration with the system will become even worse as these phenomena unfold. So anything that puts emphasis on renewing infrastructure and linking that to employment, and sort of longer term can be a key to solution. And then dealing with these issues that people burden about, issues to do with health and education and transport. It's, you know, it's not rocket science. We used to have sort of well-functioning systems, and we still do to an extent. I mean, if you see what happened with vaccines in the UK, that is an example of when things go right, and so we can get things right. But you need the political will and you need the public support for that to happen. I'm not an economist to go into more detail about sort of what sort of tax system you need to have that sort of fairness, but for sure, we've all seen the graphs that show that the sort of top 1% or the top 20% becoming much richer, and then the middle class over the last 20 or 30 or 40 years being hit hardest. So I think it's key to sort of viability of liberal democracies to sort that out, because if they don't, anything else is going to be academic. You know, it's if people don't have jobs, and if they don't have money, and if they don't have the promise of a better future, then it will be very difficult for them to trust any system.
Okay, a bit of a follow-up. One question that just came in, but it seems directly related, so I'll jump to this one before getting to the other questions. What about a wealth tax on the richest 1%?
Yeah, and I mean, and you know, funnily enough, some prominent members of that 1% have come out themselves and have said we are happy to be taxed. And I mean, even if they're not, you know, I mean, I would be personally in favor of it, and I think that discussion has been happening, especially in the United States and parts of Europe. I mean, I was reading in the newspaper, in the British newspaper a few days ago, that the government is now considering possibly taking some measures to delay moving sort of the tax bands, sort of increasing the tax boundaries, which is a progressive tax measure because it will proportionately affect the richest people rather than the poorest people. So measures, progressive measures like that, it's not just in substance, which is very important, but it's also, it reinforces trust to the system because it looks responsive, and it looks like the system is not taking from the poor to give to the rich. And I think we've seen, so the level of inequality, I think, justifies definitely a wealth tax. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to take my host privileges here to end up asking a question. I was wondering, Greece is seen by many in the West as the basis for the corpus of Western values. What role, if any, do you see for the country in the ongoing reconceptualization of the West, in particular, given its close proximity to one of the more problematic actors that you identified in Turkey?
Yeah, so I think Greece is Greece can play a really important role that is way disproportionate to its size and to its sort of its conventional economic sort of state, although it now has thankfully sort of gone out of the crisis after 10 years. But I think Greece can play that role in a number of ways because it is positioned in that space between Europe, Asia, and Africa, and it is sort of in constant dialogue with its neighbors, and it's part of many institutions and organizations, not just the EU and NATO, but other regional organizations as well. So I think Greece can play a really, through its soft power and through its sort of symbolisms, as you said, I think it could be part of that. It could lead a campaign to inspire again and sort of, I don't want to use the word baptize again, or rebaptize, sort of the West with these values of democracy. So I think it can definitely play that role. And of course, you have to be realistic, and you have to always take into account the day-to-day realities of international relations, which are tough, and things are not easy. And I'm not just talking about COVID, I'm talking about sort of the geopolitical situation. But I think there's enough soft power there, not just by virtue of ancient Greece, but also by virtue of modern Greece as well, that it can definitely use that to act as an ambassador for Western values. And maybe it will have, precisely because it can talk to Russia, it can talk to China, it can talk to other actors, I think it can play a really good role as an intermediary for some of these discussions.
All right, thank you. We have a question here from our director, Dr. Dimitris Kralis, so I'll let him ask it.
It's not so much that I want to ask a question, but I want to do that by way of one of our guests who's asking a series of stark questions. I'll focus on one. Talking of values, in 1996, seminal work, The Clash of Civilization, Samuel Huntington candidly and factually admits the West won the world not by the superiority of its ideas or values or religion, but rather by its superiority in applying organized violence. Westerners often forget this fact, non-Westerners never do. Given that the minority West exists among majority others and must share values, and that violence is no longer a modus operandi, okay, that can be discussed, in an emerging age of globalization and free trade, to assume a future has the West taken any corrective action to change its core values that it has followed for the past 300 years. Now, this is a long question, but it takes us to a number of core issues that you raised with your talk. What norms are we talking about? What is this global order that needs to be shored up? Is a UN where there is a quasi-colonial Security Council with veto powers even a meaningful organization? And how could the quotation marks West address such a fundamental critique?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, it's a great question. I mean, I would maybe kind of like sort of qualify, I don't want to say I disagree with the premise, but I would qualify the premise and say that that of course the result of where we are, and there is, as I think I admitted, that the West has kind of like dark aspects to its past for sure, and you can't just like win hearts and minds with like roses and goodwill, of course. But I would say that that can't negate the contribution, especially after World War II, in terms of what we now recognize, hopefully, as universal. There are these foundational texts, the universal declarations of the rights of humans and children and all these things about, a framework of international law and agreements, treaties that were put in place. And these are not Western concepts that were put in place by the UN post World War II. And I think what is at stake here is not necessarily, it's not about the economic interests of the West as much as the rules of the game. And by rules of the game, I mean whether these institutions are relevant. And I agree with you. I think the United Nations Security Council needs radical reform. Huge countries, democracies are not part of it. I'm saying democracies just sort of to say, by the way, they're democracies, and it's completely paralyzed with the veto and so on. And as you say, it is the outcome. It reflects the configuration of the victories after World War II. Having said that, we can't sort of we shouldn't disregard the extreme value of the work that UN agencies are doing. For example, the World Health Organization, or FAO, the Food Agricultural Organization, or bodies on climate change, and a whole host of other issues. So the UN is not just a Security Council, and of course, as they always say, the UN is as good as the member states. So while I completely agree with you that about we need to critically engage and be reflective about the norms, and this is why I said, you can't have a third Obama term, because the idea that you can have like a 1990s style of sort of like liberal interventionism and go into countries and like export democracy, I don't think that is relevant anymore as a concept. So it's not about that. It's more about how do you then regions and powers coexist as peacefully as possible in a multipolar world, and how can they, as much as possible, address global challenges that are not about one or two of them, but about sort of the system as a whole, because essentially you need that collaboration for the system to continue. You can't just have the system continue through competition and war alone. It's not going to happen. I don't know if that answers your question, but I mean, it's a great question. I don't think it can be easily answered, but I think that's how I would qualify it.
No, I think it makes a lot of sense. If I would follow up with a question, and it would link up with both Russia and China, and then I'll try and leave it for the many questions that are filtering in. During the Cold War period, you could say that there was a true values clash between, let's say, a Western individualist kind of democratic system and different versions of the communist kind of dream for building a new kind of society. That dream is no longer there. In the absence of that dream, how does one read the end game of countries like Russia or China? Is it a values end game, or is it the most probably basic of value, the nation state in its most kind of realpolitik expression?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a great question. I think that question is much harder for Russia than it is for China, in the sense that China, I mean, has, despite kind of like the issues, the security issues and the human rights issues caused by some of the actions of the government, it has a much more coherent and comprehensive narrative about it. It has a story, it has a set of values, it has a vision that to us may appear, of course, it's revisionist, it causes security issues and so on and so forth. Domestically, it's much more coherent, and it is much more viable than I think what is happening in Russia, where there is a lack of what you're describing. There is sort of that old dream, so that old vision is gone, or that old value system is gone, and this is why some people say, it's kind of like, it's dangerous because it's like a kleptocracy where it doesn't work for the people, the system doesn't work. And so I think the corollary is what happens when Putin goes one way, or eventually, he's human, he's mortal. At some point, he will move on, and so what happens then? Because at the moment you have this system that is based on the one person. Of course, you have important and powerful state structures, but he has provided that narrative, he has provided that vision of the Great Russia. He has almost embodied that, and if you see all the sort of how he projects as a leader, it's a key part of what he's doing. So when you take that out, what is left then? So I think he has sort of like substituted that system that you talked about. But for me, the question is what happens after Putin. I don't want to be a pessimist. I don't want to say that I don't believe that you can have a system with realpolitik for very long, because that's not part of human nature. So I'm deep down, like a romantic optimist, and I believe that eventually people will seek to find a way to develop those narratives. And by the way, you said that the Soviet system, and you're right, that it sort of collapsed. I would say that even the Western, the American dream it's kind of like in its former version is gone. So it's not just like that, the one side won and will live happily ever after. I mean, it is the side that won for the reasons that I explained, I think, is facing a crisis. So it needs to re-articulate that vision, and who knows what the re-articulation will be. But I think I think we've seen efforts to do that, and I think in a kind of like twisted way, a lot of the debates on social media about kind of like identity politics and all that stuff is a very kind of like clumsy attempt to re-articulate that vision about social justice and equality. So I think I think that shift is going to be towards equality. Equality is becoming in the research and the data we see, it's becoming a much more important factor for younger people than it ever was in the West. It wasn't equality that was a driver in the West. It was like freedom or prosperity, material prosperity, and so on, or whatever comes with that, or social acceptance. But equality seems to be much more, which is interesting because equality was supposedly the trump card of the other system, right?
Okay, excellent. And kind of this one's gets to one of your points about the tensions within kind of the West as it ends up being conceived, and a bit more of a comment. We'll see if you would like to comment a bit upon it. It may not be appropriate to amalgamate the U.S. with the West. Far from being a world policeman, the U.S. has become the bully itching to use force, and then pretending it's mainly because they had no choice with the primary objective to maintain the petrodollar, the preeminent global fiat currency issued by a private bank, the Federal Reserve. So do you want to comment anything upon that, or would you?
I mean, what I would say is, I mean, you could make a lot of criticisms of the United States. I mean, you could look at, Guantanamo and what happened in Iraq, and just on the basis of that, like sort of say, and I hear that from my own students who say, whenever we have these discussions about the West and the United States, there is, yes, but like, we do the same, or we do, things like, are equally bad as sort of Putin is doing. And I mean, for me, the important thing is to, no system is perfect, and it's not about, one country being dominant or about being a police person or whatever it is. It is about striving to progress and to get better. So I think what the American system allowed was that process of trying to kind of like reach sort of an outcome that, of course, you're never going to reach the perfect society, but it is about creating the circumstances or the conditions that allow you to try. And I'm not saying that it's happened in recent years. We've seen a lot of problems, but I wouldn't necessarily agree with the premise of the question. I think the US still has many hugely important leadership role in the world, and a lot of reasons for us to sort of look up to it.
Okay, excellent. Returning to the issue of Russia and China, do you see Russia as being content to be the junior partner in an anti-Western alliance? Kind of getting to some of the issues that you would potentially identify with Putin earlier?
I don't think so necessarily. I don't think I think I would actually go the opposite estimate and say, and actually I argue that Russia could be a potential strategic partner of the West if relations with China deteriorate, which again, I repeat, they don't have to deteriorate. The Thucydides trap is not inevitable, but so I don't necessarily think that. I think the relationship between Russia and China may be more opportunistic than kind of like strategic, and I think Russia and the West, despite everything that I know that it looks really bad from what I showed, and it's the truth, but actually deep down I think Russia and the West can work together, and so I don't necessarily think that I don't think what you're seeing is an anti-Western alliance per se. It's not that these three countries, for example, that I mentioned, have somehow united in, then they've created kind of like an authoritarian international. It's not about that. It's more about each government making, taking advantage of the opportunities and the flaws of the other side. And I think that's what's been happening, really.
Hey, this question's from me and kind of building upon that point a little bit. David Kilcullen's recent book takes the value argument that you identified a bit for granted, but argues there needs to be a fundamental kind of strategic change within the West, and that Russia and China, a couple of other actors are as well, are exceptional exploiting the red line issue that you identified. How do you see a red line kind of being implemented given these actors' ability to kind of exploit it, kind of work towards just short of the actual conflict in the past?
Yeah, this is a really good question, and it's not by no means easy. Like we saw what happens. I mean, the problem with red lines is that you have to be really serious about them. And for example, sort of people think that the biggest mistake that Obama made in his foreign policy was that he drew a red line for Syria and Assad's use of chemical weapons, and then he didn't sort of go ahead with sort of the consequences when Assad went over the red line. So I think it can be really dangerous with when you draw a red line and then you don't actually enforce it. So I think we have to be really careful. So for example, and we will face that. I think it's inevitable we'll face the question of, does the West intervene in any way if sort of China sort of flexes its muscle in Taiwan, and to what extent? It's sort of similar to Ukraine. It's similar to, and Ukraine is just far from over. And so, the issue in Ukraine is another, I mean, it is a frozen conflict, but it's not going to be a frozen conflict forever. Or if it is, it means that then what you get is a new reality. So I think there will be both isolated cases like Ukraine, like Taiwan, where the West is going to have to make up its mind whether that is like over a red line or not. But I think it's, in the first instance, for me, a much clearer red line is about protecting the homeland, as it were. So not, being attacked is a red line. Not having chemical weapons in the middle of a, town square is a red line. So there are some easy, low-hanging fruit. There are some easy red lines which you can pose, but of course, it can't just be an empty word. It has to be credible. And for it to be credible, you need to develop all those mechanisms and the strategies of deterrence that I mentioned. Otherwise, you're not just sort of losing that red line, you're losing your credibility altogether. And I think that sort of happened a little bit over the last few years.
Yeah, building upon that a little bit, one of the issues that tends to be popping up, and it's one that you actually identify in the presentation, particular cybersecurity with regards to some of those issues. How would you end up, not to put you too much on the spot, but in terms of potentially drawing red lines along those areas? Can you see a way of potentially doing so?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, of course, it's much harder, but so I think in terms of what we've seen now the last couple of days, the discussion around countermeasures. So I don't know if our viewers have seen that, but there is an expectation that the United States will launch countermeasures against those countries that were that participated in hacking and cyber attacks. And it's from an international law perspective, it's a can of worms, because I mean, I've got I've got PhD students who are doing that because there is no precedent, there is no international law that actually regulates. You can talk about self-defense, of course, but all that becomes murkier in practice when we're talking about hybrid and cyber. So even from that perspective, we're talking about values and norms, and so the proposition that we should sort of strike back is just at the edge of those numbers. But then if you've been attacked, so we need to think of what to be a proportionate response. And I don't think that necessarily countermeasures are like a disproportionate response. If somebody has tried to hack your critical infrastructure and you've got like a power outage, and then people die because of that, so that is a hostile attack. That's a hostile action, and just doing something that is proportionate, not necessarily killing people, but like sort of something that will show to the other side that every other attack will be followed by an attack that is sort of proportionate and that creates problems, I think that's how you start to build red lines that are credible. And it's much harder to do in cyber and hybrid. And I think the problem, part of the problem is that it's less visible to the public because these things happen a little bit under the radar. And a lot of deterrence and that game is about appearances, and it is about sort of looking that you have won or looking credible. So it's, I think, particular challenge is that it's not like traditional warfare or traditional attacks where these things are all out there in public. It's sort of it can be hidden. But I think, without being too technical, that it's in terms of like principles of being open to the idea of retaliation or the threat of retaliation, that can be kind of like a way to apply deterrence to cyber and hybrid.
Excellent, thank you. Now we'll return to some of the questions from the audience. One question is, why was Saudi Arabia not mentioned? The weakness of the U.S. concern their lack of condemnation of the murder of Khashoggi is very worrying.
Yeah, so Saudi Arabia is, of course, is an interesting case in its own merit, like in the context of the Middle East. I wouldn't necessarily say that, of course, the assassination of Khashoggi was definitely, it has to be condemned, and like I'm with you on being frustrated about the lack of further response, but it doesn't, I wouldn't say that it necessarily poses a security threat for the West per se. It is a question that, it's more a discussion about, what should the West engagement be in the Middle East anyway, and then and I think it has to be part of that discussion of, who are your allies, and what do you ask of them, and what do you give them, and then what is your overall strategy about achieving peace in the Middle East. So I think Saudi Arabia's role is more pertinent in that discussion than it is in discussion about security threats domestically in the West.
Okay, excellent, thank you. We have another question here from Angelina. The U.S. is Canada's largest trading partner and always will be. What happens to them culturally and economically happens to Canada, and although Canada has had a separate international policy, it does not pay to oppose the U.S. policies. Can you please comment on anti-U.S. sentiment in Canada and how this could be productive?
Right. So thank you for asking that question, because I've forgotten like 4 times now to make the point about Canada that I meant to make during my original presentation. I'm not an expert in anti-American sentiment or anti-US sentiment in Canada, but what I can say is that, and we saw this firsthand during NATO engages. Like I was there, I almost rubbed shoulders with your Prime Minister just by accident in the staircase, but like we've seen Canada be a force for the values that I was talking about. And I think, again, Canada is a case of a country like Greece that has a lot of soft power and goodwill in the international community, and that it can play a role that is not necessarily proportionate to maybe to kind of like sort of its sort of military, or even though Canada is present militarily in Europe, but to sort of its global power. So I think, there are others who are more experts on the relationship between Canada and the US, but in terms of the framework that I presented, I think Canada has a really vital role. And actually, when I was interviewing experts from Eastern Europe, they were adamant that they want Canada to remain engaged in Eastern Europe, that the Transatlantic alliance is not just between the US and Eastern Europe or Europe. It is between the US and Canada and Europe. And in fact, we've seen, I was watching a recent event organized by NATO, and there was an interesting proposition that even countries like Mexico could be approached to either join the NATO or become sort of engaged with NATO, in terms of like, we've seen, as I showed in my last slide, that idea of a global West and a global NATO engaging with the world. And I think Canada will have a role to play in all of the structures that I showed, to do with whether that is the G7 or the D10 or the Summit for Democracy or NATO or anything else that comes to in addition to these. I think Canada will be central to that.
Excellent. Thank you there. For our next question, it gets to the point that you raised about one of the problems within the West being the increased polarization that started to occur in the past bit. You may even mention a little bit about hybrid warfare and how this ends up being conducted. In what ways do you think liberal democracies would need to change socioeconomic, political, etc., to curb the advancement of pro-authoritarian parties and leaders?
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard because we had these debates in Greece. You know, there was a neo-Nazi party called the Golden Dawn, and there was a big debate at the time of whether, you know, it can be sort of outlawed. Or there was a similar discussions in Germany with their far-right parties. And if I'm interpreting your question right, I mean, I think it's dangerous territory when a democratic system starts to kind of like actively when the political system itself, i.e. other parties or the government, starts to try to stop, you know, various parties if they are sort of formal official political parties. And I think that was a very sort of difficult territory. In a way, Greece sort of escaped that because the Golden Dawn engaged in criminal activities. So the state authorities were able to get to them and outlaw them as a criminal organization, rather than just like as an extremist party, because that poses the question of you know, who decides what is extremist and so on and so forth. So in terms of so I think polarization is actually the number one threat in terms of the United States domestic situation, and I'm very concerned about the emergence of two parallel universes that don't even communicate with each other, and that take their news and their realities from different, you know, channels and from different sort of platforms. And I think it's really important to link the issue of polarization and the health of a liberal democracy with the communication landscape. Now I'm putting my communication media hat on to say that when you have a public sphere that is fragmented, not just fragmented in multiple pieces, but that you have these parallel media spheres that do not much interact, that creates a really bad, that creates the conditions for major structural problems in democracy. So I think the way to address that is by trying to not control the communication landscape, but to regulate it and ensure that that you still have that public sphere, that it's still sort of working at least at the minimal level. And you know, it will be interesting to see, for example, when Twitter and Facebook and other platforms, Google and Amazon, you know, kick off these extremist groups in the US, if they will move, if that sort of subculture will move to online platforms that cannot be regulated, that cannot be switched off, that cannot be kind of like controlled as much because they are encrypted or because they're underground, and the issues that will create. I hope it won't happen, but it's a risk. It's a threat.
Excellent. Thank you. Another question we have here is, despite the mention of values, much of the talk today has been about tactics, i.e. seeing the East as a threat and how to potentially end up countering it. Would it not be more fruitful to go back to the debate 2,400 years ago, that was between the rule of the demos versus that of learn it with values? Why does the West keep on killing its Socrates?
Right. So, I mean, I think we do need to engage with, we do need to think about what values we want to focus on, what values we want to protect. And I think I mentioned that. But to be honest with you, I don't think we even at that stage. I think we're at an earlier stage of like really understanding that there is a problem. So I guess that's why the first part of my talk was like, listen, you know, we need to talk about values and we need to talk about security threats because they pose an existential risk. So I mean, we don't necessarily need to reinvent the wheel. You know, the values of that I mentioned towards the end of free elections, you know, of the rule of law, of freedom of expression. I mean, these are there. You know, they will always be negotiated in a sort of active society, but we don't need to kind of like reinvent them. It's more the question about how do you deal with members of your community that are demonstrably moving away from those values? And that, to be very specific, that question has come up again and again in the context of, for example, Hungary and Poland in the European Union and Turkey, NATO, when countries engage in domestic activities where that is thought by other member states that is contravenes certain values, and what should the community do? So it's more about understanding the threats to our values and seeing what we can do. But so that does not preclude engaging with the values themselves. So you mentioned like ancient Greece and Athens and Socrates. I mean, and the demos, and of course, democracy is hugely important. But in the context of global security, I would even dare say that democracy is, when we're talking about how the West engages with the rest of the world, democracy is of course really important, but it's secondary to ensuring that states coexist peacefully, and then you can start to talk about the regimes within those states and what happens within those states. But we should never forget that our enemy is like war. It's not just about perfecting the situation within each country. It's also about the system and the security of the system. And so I think my argument is that our weaknesses and our mistakes have indirectly threatened global security, and they've indirectly threatened those things that are even more about, they're not about democracy, they're about basically peace and war. And because if you allow what I described to sort of go on and on, eventually you will end up with war anyway.
Hey, excellent, thank you. We have another question or comment from Dr. Crowley, so I'll turn it over to him for a second.
So, I mean, ultimately, in a discussion of where whether we use the quotation marks or not, we talk of the West, and I understand why we do that. I mean, I'm not going to contest that. We automatically start evoking ideas of, as you said, security, which often means clarity in borders and definition of the West versus something else. In the practical reality of a Mediterranean that is permeable, and of a climate change afflicted Near East or North Africa, which will send necessarily, as a matter of climate fact, more people into movement. How do you maintain the values of a liberal democracy with Berlin Wall style measures on the borders of that West? Is it feasible to be happy and democratically committed to an equality even that you say the young people are interested in, when you can't seem to find, as a West, I mean, the way to integrate the people who come in and make them part of that vision, and borders become so stark?
Yeah, no, I mean, listen, I agree that there's a tension there, but I would also say, and we can be critical of the EU and the West for many things. I would say that it's in as you said, the practical realities of, say, climate change leading to movement. Equally realistically, any community, it will be it's difficult. It's always been for any community to accept new members and to kind of like welcome them, especially when that movement has been like violent or violent in terms of volume and in terms of speed. So what happened, for example, in 2015 in Germany, where you have 1.5 million, or 2015, 2016, 1.5 million migrants coming in, and not having, I mean, there was criticism, there was maybe a bit of backlash against Merkel and so on. It's not like that the government was destabilized, the social cohesion, the social fabric didn't break or anything like that. I mean, they were quite good. They've been quite good at integrating them. So I think it can be done. It doesn't, having said that, and I think, by the way, that, Greece We recently finished like a major study on the integration of migrants and refugees in Greece and Europe, and I think there's definitely a lot more capacity demographically in the West to accept people, right? So having said all that, I don't think realistically we're at a point where we can do away with borders. Like, I don't think that's going to happen, and I don't think that's necessarily a safe thing to happen. So I mean, it's where do you draw the line between open borders and closed borders? And I think that's an important point. And to go to your question about specifically having a shift because of climate change, this is precisely why we need to be proactive, and we need to invest, in these infrastructural investments in, for example, Northern Africa and the Middle East, that will provide water, that will provide energy, that will provide all those things that can be done, and that can be done with technology. I think we have the resources and we have the know-how to do it. I think the problem is gaining traction in terms of the political agenda and the public agenda to support these things. We've seen the public agenda shift a little bit more towards like carbon capture and some of these other things that we'll have to do over the next few decades. But I think sort of protecting or helping regions remain stable because of climate change is kind of like 2 or 3 steps down the line in terms of realistically what's going to happen in the West. I think it can happen and it should happen, but yeah, I agree with you. There is sometimes an element of hypocrisy when you say like we're all democratic and happy, but democracy is still a demos. You still need a community, and as I said, the communities you still need, it's still sort of finite, and so it's how do you manage that border there. And I don't think that you can necessarily do completely away with borders, because that creates all sorts of other issues. That is not, I'm not in favor of Fortress Europe, and I think again, there's demographic margin for for a lot more people to come in if needed, but equally we don't even have to get to an extremist point. There are things you can do as a European Union, for example, to help develop to help the development of countries so that we don't reach that point, if that makes sense.
I think that what I find very interesting in your answer, and I did not mean to ask the question in a way that says take a stark position on this, but your answer helps raise one of the issues that one of the questions also raised, the idea between tactics and values. Mm-hmm. And sometimes people are derogatory towards tactics, but to reach the point where Europe can go past the stark border position and get more people in, you need serious governance and preparation and change perhaps of the model, as we also discussed in social terms, towards equality, towards taxes, and that's tactics, and that's governance, and it's as important as values.
Oh my God, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, otherwise you're just basically going to like engineer disaster. I mean, it is good governance and good planning, and it's kind of I've lived in the UK now for 20 years, and I've learned to appreciate good bureaucracy, basically, because it is important to like getting the trains to run on time, and being as a Greek, I'm more drawn to kind of like higher visions and more romantic notions of what needs to happen, but equally as you say, tactics are important.
Okay, we're quickly running out of time here for the questions, so if you haven't asked a question yet, please jump in and I will end up trying to make sure that it gets in on time. But we have another question from Yanni. You've described Turkey as a rogue state-like new opponent to the West power in the world. Others have referred to Turkey as a neo-Ottoman imperial power. To what degree do you agree or disagree with this statement? And what role do you see Turkey playing in geopolitics as Erdogan seeks to turn it into a leader in the Muslim world?
So it's interesting because that discussion has happened. We've seen that discussion come up a lot over the last year and a half, I would say. So when we did the research and when we did the documentary, it was just starting to emerge, that idea, like that sort of Turkey is now even being considered by the foreign policy community or the intelligence community in the West as a potential rogue state. But also a lot has happened over the last year. That sort of engagement in Armenia and Azerbaijan, the situation in Evros and in the Aegean Sea in the Eastern Mediterranean, some of the situations in Libya, all that has happened over the last year and a half. So I think there is a pattern of behavior there, and it's that is making life really difficult for organizations and governments in the West. So it's sort of Erdogan's Turkey, and of course I'm not talking about the whole country and the whole people. Of course, it is a government, and it is actually a government that wasn't always like that. That has been like that for a number of years now. That is behaving in this way. So I definitely agree with that statement, but again, I don't think that's reverse. I don't think that's irreversible in terms of, I think that Erdogan has utilized, for example, Trump's tolerance or attitude towards him, for one thing. But I would say that Turkey is extremely important. I mean, everybody knows that, and everybody knows that Turkey is a major ally of the United States, that it's geopolitically important, that it's important because of its position next to Syria, next to the Middle East, on the way to Russia, and so it's bound to be, by virtue of its geographic placing, important no matter what happens. The question is whether it's going to be a stabilizing force or a destabilizing force. I think it's been on a trajectory of being a destabilizing force for several months, years, and whereas it could play a really constructive role in the region. So it's not inevitable. It's just, the question is, how much support does Erdogan have within Turkey? And I think there are differing opinions on that. There is an opinion that there is a very strong pro-European opposition in Turkey, and then there are views that his support remains constant, or maybe there are different. Of course, there are different demographic and political groups within Turkey, as in any country. But I generally agree with that statement. I would just say that Turkey will always be an important country geopolitically, and that's precisely why its current behavior is so problematic and destabilizing, precisely because of its importance.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. I have more statement, but if you want to add something here, it gets to one of the points you raised earlier, as well as talking about some of the dynamics of hybrid warfare, where the West is holding on to kind of a Westphalian conception of nation state. I believe Dr. Krauss also mentioned it with fixation on borders. Well, Abbas argues that China and Russia's BRI and New Silk Road aims to kind of eliminate some of these borders potentially. Where do you kind of see some of these dynamics fitting in with like this tension between the Westphalian world as well as the increased globalization, and how can the West perhaps check some of these dynamics perhaps as well?
Yeah, that's a complex and a difficult question. I don't know that I can answer it sort of satisfactorily right now, but I think the argument about the Belt and Road Initiative and and train networks and so on, I don't, of course, infrastructure networks are great. I don't necessarily buy that it's sort of this benign, globalized, cosmopolitan initiative. I see it much more as kind of like part of China's agenda. So I wouldn't necessarily say that it's that initiatives like that or projects like that they're definitely part of globalization, and we've seen globalization at play in Greece with China's investments in ports and sort of systems and networks and so on. But it's not like that these things are completely supernatural, not supranational. They do serve national agendas. So for something to be transcendent, if you like, in that sense, I think it has to come from a legitimate institution like the UN, for example, or like sort of a successor body, or like an alliance that is truly, in a way, intergovernmental. in terms of like that tension between borders and globalization, I mean, I don't know that I have an answer for that. I think a lot of the tension, it's not just about physical borders. I think it's also about what we were saying before about identities and communities and sense of belonging, and so a lot of the tension comes from people's sense of belonging, and for many people, who are not part of the liberal elites, who are not on Facebook, who are not following this, these discussions, the nation or the nation state is still their primary identifier and their primary point of reference. So we shouldn't, and we saw that, with Brexit, and we saw it with Trump. So we shouldn't disregard the salience of that. What I said in the slides was that the nation is inadequate de facto to deal with global challenges. So, we used to talk about multi-level governance back in the late 90s and early 2000s as sort of like this new reality. I think the problem, of course, that's a reality now, but the problem is that people find it really, really hard to identify with that, and it's hard to know. It's hard to have lines of accountability and sort of democratic accountability when you have such multi-layered governance. People want to know who's responsible for the things that are happening in their lives, and that's been such an interesting lesson of the COVID story here in the UK, where when you had a very decentralized system, it was much harder to implement measures, whereas when the government eventually sort of took control and like implemented the vaccine program, it became much more successful, but it was also much more accountable directly. That is not necessarily an argument for like centralizing everything. It's just I'm trying to more to highlight the tensions that creates for democracy when you have those multiple layers of governance that are some of them within borders and some of them across borders.
Okay, excellent there. Thank you so much. I'll make this the final question, especially because you've been way more than kind, especially with the time zone differences involved. Thank you for an articulate and optimistic talk. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the relationship between national borders and powerful non-state actors, which depend on being able to transgress these borders at will to conduct their business. I'm thinking especially of tech companies. This is an example of the inadequacy of the nation, which you discussed, but it could also be an opportunity to reassert the nation as a site for democratic sovereign action.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. I mean, that question is amazing, is really, really important. It's interesting because a few years ago, I was thinking that in kind of like sort of one of the scenarios that we might face in the future would be big tech companies coming to to the rescue, especially if the populist movements and in Europe and the United States kind of like sort of went if we sort of went and beyond the parameters of the system, of the constitutional system, it would be interesting to see how big tech companies, ironically, could come to the rescue of liberal democracy. But there are so many issues there that I think I agree with you, and I think we're already late in regulating big tech. I'm in favor of regulating concentration of ownership, regulating like the data, how they handle and sell our data, and how they use advertising for like political issues and so on. They're sort of anything, they're all sorts of like tools and issues and questions that we can engage with to do with the role of big tech, not just in our lives, but also, as you say, across borders. And it will, I mean, we saw recently a tug of war between Facebook and Australia, the Australian government, and we've seen similar debates between the EU and Google, between the EU and Facebook. And I'm worried because there is a clear, every political theory, every democratic theory is non-applicable in the case of big tech, because nobody elected these people and there's no institutional oversight. There's no, there's nothing, the normal rules of political thinking don't apply because these are not political institutions, yet they carry political power. So So I think the question you're asking is really important, because we need to rethink some of these tools that we've used to interpret and explain like how democracies work, to account for the operation of these corporations. Not to like, again, to demonize social media, but I think, to be honest with you, I would also say that I don't think we've used the tools that are already at our disposal because of political reasons, or of like sort of corruption or whatever it is, or because of the governments haven't just done that. But so there are already enough things we could do. But what you're saying about them transcending borders, whereas governments are restricted by borders, I think that's exactly what is driving this issue right now. And this is why governments are struggling so much to deal with it. And this is exactly why I said that the national is not enough, because how can you as one country face like Amazon or Facebook or Google? This is exactly why you need a big coalition for these values that will try to at least regulate their activities and also their tax.
Excellent there. Thank you so much, not only for the answer to that question, but also for a very informative talk and answering all of our audience's questions. It was quite an informative discussion, quite an informative lecture. And once again, I would like to thank you, Dr. Yarodimos, as well as the audience as well, for all their participation. It really makes for an interesting discussion.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure. And thank you for all these amazing questions that really kind of like enriched my thinking, and I learned a lot from your questions as well. And yeah, look forward to seeing you again on Thursday.
Yeah, likewise. As a reminder to everybody, we are going through elements of Dr. Gerodimos' documentary Deterrence on Thursday. You don't have to watch it ahead of time. You will have the clips for you to end up watching, and we'll have a further discussion dealing with some of the elements that we dealt with today, but some additional new ones as well that we're going to pick out and tease out from the documentary. So once again, I would like to thank everybody for participating, and I hope you have a great rest of the day and hope to see you on Thursday. Take care, everybody.